Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Rachel Paul with IAAP. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on accessibility in employment processes. Before we begin, just a few items to go over. There is closed captioning provided. You can select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and posted in the chat is a cart link if you would like to use that. We do have ASL provided today. All attending microphones are muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions. And today's session is being recorded and will be made available afterwards, and we will share that recording link out to everyone. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, but I encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A as you think of them, and the chat will be monitored for any general dialogue or technical issues. And to get our program started today, I'm happy to introduce IAAP Managing Director, Christopher Lee. Thank you.
Morning, y'all. Good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you're at. We have an incredible webinar set for today, accessibility in employment processes. We're going to focus on the state of accessibility in the digital tools and platforms. We have two great panelists to join us today for the presentation. We have Alwar. Alwar is the CEO of Fable. Fable is a leading accessibility platform powered by people with disabilities. And we love that. That's awesome. And she has a degree in UX design. She has a master of inclusive design. She has focused her research on designing technology for aging, which is very interesting. And so definitely welcome, Aura. And Sam, we've got you here. You are an accessibility evangelist. And Sam, we call, in quotes, I'm putting in quotes, the voice, because he's got quite an amazing voice, as you will hear in just a second. And he is Fable's community manager. So I just want to say thank you for joining us. We're excited to be partnering with Fable in regards to this webinar, some of the research that we have done. And I'll turn it over to y'all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christopher, for those intros. We're really excited about this webinar, and we are also excited about our partnership with G3ICT. Accessibility in employment processes is such a crucial part of, ultimately building inclusive products and inclusive teams. So we're glad that this is a topic that all of you have joined and are interested in learning about. What I'd like to do is first just start off with what are we planning to go over for this session. We'll give you a little bit intro about Fable and our philosophy towards accessibility and how we're practicing it. And then we're going to dive into a survey that we've conducted with G3ICT on the experiences of people with disabilities when searching for employment and working. And so we're going to go over some insights. And Sam and I this is a pretty free-flowing discussion. So we're just going to have a discussion on points and insights that we see there. And then the last part of the session, we're going to move into what can employers do to start improving their employment processes. So to kick it off, at Fable, we are, we've built an accessibility platform that's powered by people with disabilities. Our goal is to help organizations across the world build inclusive and accessible products. The way we think of accessibility is not just focused on people with disabilities having access to the digital product and to the digital world. We're really focused on people with disabilities being able to fully participate as producers, contributors, and consumers of the digital world. And the way we see it, we're helping companies make products accessible, but a core part of our company is providing flexible working opportunities to people with disabilities. And the way we kind of measure impact in that area is by really looking at our community and seeing how are we helping them move forward. And one of the big things that we've seen, with our community is providing financial independence is so key. And so I have a couple of quotes on the screen, and one of our community members said that, the work that they're doing with Fable has helped them make a payment for a van. It's something simple, but being able to make that choice independently by yourself is a huge impact, and that's what employment's about. Well, we have another quote from another community member who said they were able to save up to buy a TV to make their hobbies easier to do because of their vision loss. This is a choice that they were able to do and not depend on ODSP or someone else to make that decision. Another community member said, I have personally assisted about 50 companies to create and modify their websites and apps. This comes to being valued and recognized, that they're bringing skill sets that are valuable and are being recognized for that. So we're going to definitely jump into the discussion, which is going to focus on tools and processes. But I wanted to kick it off with just having that high level idea of the reason we're talking about this is much broader and the impact of it is much broader. So I want to hand it over to Sam now to kind of talk about accessibility and employment.
Absolutely. As Alwar just shared, it's employment that is really important and that makes such an impact on financial independence, on independence in general, and on dignity. And yet there are a lot of barriers throughout the employment process that make it very difficult, far more difficult than it should be for those of us with disabilities like myself as a completely blind screen reader user to gain employment. And so as we conducted this research to figure out where those barriers are, we thought that it would be useful to divide the employment journey into 3 stages. And so I'm going to discuss those stages now and a little bit of my personal experiences with each one. So the first stage in gaining employment is identification and application. And so that involves identifying a job, finding a job that you are skilled and able to do, and then applying for that job. Now, of course, the first barrier that we find here is not every job posting website is fully accessible, unfortunately. Most have accessibility barriers that impact people's ability to apply for jobs and to find jobs. And so as a person with a disability looking for work, I am reliant on the job websites that I can use. And of course, not every company posts every job to every website. So already my market for jobs is restricted to the sites that are at least accessible enough for me to use. And of course, submitting that application is not always easy either. And there can be some real barriers there. I remember one notable experience that I had during my job search. I was trying to submit an application, but of course they had a CAPTCHA on the application form, and it's those numbers and letters that you look at and have to type in. They didn't have any alternative to that. And so what I tried to do was I tried to use the contact form and contact the company's support. And of course, they told me, oh, well, unfortunately, it's company policy. We're not able to give out contacts for people in HR. So eventually, I had to go on LinkedIn and find HR contacts for this company that I really wanted to apply for a job for. And of course, that starts the job application process off on a really poor footing because I'm having to disclose, hey, I'm a person with a disability and I can't even apply for your job because of an accessibility barrier. And of course, that makes the HR person or the person conducting the interview probably think, well, if you can't even get through the application process, how's he possibly going to work at this company? And so it's not a great footing to start things off on. But assuming you do get through that stage, identify a job, figure out how to submit your application despite any barriers that may exist. Then there's the interviewing and acceptance stage. And of course, that can also have a lot of barriers and a lot of stress, because if you are conducting an interview, are the online tools that are required to conduct the interview, if it's online, accessible? If it's an offline interview, is it accessible to travel there? Is there good public transit? Is the building accessible? Is the interview conducted in an accessible space? And of course, have there been any accommodations that may be necessary provided for the interview? These are all things that you have to think of even before the interview, which makes preparing for an interview and putting your best foot forward for something even more stressful than it already is for everyone without having to think of any of these barriers. And you know, conducting these interviews, there are issues of disclosure and bias and cultural issues that come into play there that we'll talk about more a little bit later on. And then, of course, there's the job maintenance stage. I have spoken to too many members of our community, as well as friends with disabilities, who finally got through the identification process, the interviewing process, and got the job, only to find out that all of the tools that they were required to use were not accessible. And so they just couldn't perform the tasks required in that job and couldn't keep the job. I've also heard from too many folks who got a job, managed to make things work, and were working at a company for a number of years, and then an upgrade to some tool that they depended on to do their job was performed. And unfortunately, that upgrade broke their accessibility. And so because of that, they were unfortunately laid off. And so it's a huge impact to have finally gone through a job and found a job, and now you got to do the whole thing all over again. And so in order to learn more about these barriers and collect some of this data, we conducted a survey. And so I'll turn things over to Alwar to go into a little bit about the survey that we conducted in partnership with G3 ICT.
Yeah, just before that, I think, you know, all the points that Sam identified just speaks to how much we're asking of candidates and employees with disabilities, you know, as employers because of our shortfalls. And so this survey was an exciting one for us to run. We created a survey that was shared with the Fable community and the G3 ICT network to find out about the impact of digital tools at various stages of employment. This was an online survey, it was a paid survey, and the goal was to collect feedback directly from people with disabilities about their experience. So the survey had 55 participants, so it is a small pool, but I think it speaks to the experiences of the larger group. So just to kind of level set, you know, where we're at when it comes to employment and how accessible the whole process is. 66% of respondents feel the accessibility of digital tools has impacted their ability to find, obtain, and maintain work. Sam, does 66% feel low?
It does feel very low to me. And I think there are a few reasons that it is low like that. First of all, when people are thinking about tools that require them, that they use in order to get a job, I think some folks are very narrowly focused on like just thinking about interview tools and just thinking about job websites. But there are a whole bunch of tools that we'll get into later that are necessary in order to apply for a job and that do not have the accessibility support required. And I think the second thing that happens here is using these tools and going through the job search process is so difficult that a lot of people with disabilities are just opting out. And so they're looking for jobs in some other way, either by becoming entrepreneurs or by reaching out to friends and family, or just doing the whole job search in some alternative other way because the tools are so inaccessible.
Yeah, and there's limitations there as well, right? If people are not applying through the channels that exist, then they're relying on network and just financial independence to be able to start their own company. And not everyone has access to that either. So a lot of constraints within tools, and then just outside of tools, just resources and network that you have access to. So let's dive into the next insight that we gathered, which says 87% of respondents rated the job application platforms as somewhat accessible, but still face significant barriers. So my question here, Sam, is one, what do you think about that number? And then second, what is somewhat accessible?
Yeah, exactly. When you look at that number and you look at very first glance, hey, 87% somewhat accessible. That looks pretty good until you really dig in and you really start to think about it. Because what somewhat accessible actually means is not fully accessible. And so what good does it do me or anyone with a disability if we can sign up for a job searching website, if we can log into the website and we can find a job, but we can't actually submit the application? Yeah, it was somewhat accessible, but there was one major flaw that stops you from applying to a job. And so, somewhat accessible doesn't mean accessible. And if it's not accessible, it means there are barriers that are being put up, and it means that is a higher cognitive load, a higher financial load, a higher skill load that is being required of candidates with a disability than that is being required of any other candidate, which puts people at a disadvantage, like even before the interviewing process, right? It's sets you off right on that wrong foot.
Yeah, and from an employer perspective, I have to think about this is who are we leaving behind if our platforms for employment are somewhat accessible, right? We are leaving behind people who probably match the skill sets we're looking at, but just because the tool in itself is not accessible, we're eliminating them because of that. And so what can we do to make sure that while tools are inaccessible, what are different ways we can still review candidates and make sure they're able to put an application through?
Exactly. That's so important because, as a screen reader expert and someone who is very technical and I know my way around the computer, a lot of barriers are barriers that are very inconvenient, but they're barriers that I can find my way around. But not every job is a tech job, and not every job requires technical expertise. And technical expertise is something that it takes a lifetime, I'm sure, to master, as many of you on this call who are also technical experts probably know. But how many people with disabilities are being left out of other jobs, whether it's construction or carpentry or architecture or many of the other fields that also take a lifetime to master, that are not technical fields? So much of those people, that skill that exists in people who live with a disability is just being left out of the job market entirely because they may not have the technical skills that are required to get through all of these barriers. And so they're just out of luck.
Exactly. I want to read out a quote from the survey participant, which says, applications are all digital these days. Without accessibility of these tools, resume, cover letter creation tools, social media, in-house platforms, networking tools, etc., it's impossible to even enter the pool of talented candidates for a role, let alone get noticed.
Exactly. I mean, that harkens back to something that I touched on a little bit earlier, that tools to get a job are way wider than just the job posting websites and the job application websites. Is the tool to make a nicely formatted, fully accessible resume fully accessible and easy to use for a person with a disability? Because unfortunately, the way that people judge candidates is they take a glance at the resume and cover letter, and if it doesn't visually compare well to everyone else's, you're probably not going to get the job. The same thing goes for LinkedIn profiles. Are the photos up to date, attractive, professional looking? Is the social network well maintained? All of these things can also have accessibility barriers that can prevent folks from getting a job. And of course, thirdly, the networking software and the networking opportunities. If they're not accessible, it can make it difficult. This old saying is, it's all who you know. And that extends far beyond getting a job. That also has an impact on people with disabilities who want to be entrepreneurs, who maybe found the getting a job impossible and say, let me start my own business. And then they find that they can't network as well as they could.
Yeah, I want to just extend on the point that you touched on creation tools, and how resumes might not match the other candidates. And I feel, from the employer perspective, Fable's rapidly growing, we're constantly hiring. And when you think about, HR representatives, they're looking at thousands of resumes in one go. And just because of that, visual cues play such a huge bias in deciding which resumes to even look at. And so I think from one thing that we've seen work well is well, two things. One is resumes, you're also still evaluating someone based on past experience. And if people with disabilities have always struggled getting employment, then past experience might not reflect the job that they want to actually apply for. And then second is, can we actually frame it differently? So we start asking like screener questions where people can, communicate their interest, and it's not tied to a resume, it's not tied to past experience. And that way we're able to kind of tap into a little bit more potential and see if someone would be a good fit.
Exactly, and that's so important. When we began building the Fable community built entirely of testers who use assistive technologies, the first thing that we did is we made the decision, we're not even going to ask for resumes, because when you're trying to recruit people with disabilities, it can be so intimidating to have to submit a resume and wonder, is it well formatted? Is it going to compare to everyone else's? What is the employer going to think of the job gaps in my resume? And so when building our community of testers, we really doubled down on those screener questions and asking questions and finding out not about what you may have done in the past, but who you are now and what skills you have, and evaluating those questions to make sure that we're getting the right candidates and that we're not sort of intimidating candidates who would have been great to work with us and who can use Fable as a way to enter the job market for the first time.
And yeah, and we've definitely gotten feedback where our community was able to share their experience with us, which has helped them get more employment opportunities. So I'd like to move on to the next set of insights, and this is more focused on the entry and acquisition, so the interviewing process and being able to accept a job. So the insight here we gathered was that only 13% of respondents rated the interviewing and job acceptance process as accessible. Let's just sit on that number for a while, 13%. That's extremely low. Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, it is very low, and it's not surprising, because job interviewing involves a combination of things. Job interviewing, first of all, of course, the tools matter. If you're doing an online interview, is the video tool that you're going to use accessible? Or like I said previously, if you're doing an offline interview, is the space accessible? But interviewing also involves a lot of cultural factors, because there's a lot of discussion about, in your resume, in your application process, should you disclose your disability? But for a lot of us, perhaps because we use a white cane or a wheelchair or some other assistive device, disclosure is not optional and is going to happen at the interview stage. And so what is that reaction, right, from an employer perspective, when someone comes in a wheelchair, someone walks in with a white cane and you're seeing them for the first time?
Yeah, I think, everyone has biases, and I'm sure there are situations where, people see someone with a disability and there's immediate judgment or assumption on their capabilities of, being able to be qualified for this job. I think one of the things we're seeing with, COVID and all of us moving remote, on how we're able to function online and do our jobs completely fine. And so the online interviewing, I think, has opened up, in general, has been able to open up the pool, right? We're not limited to our city, our state or country. We're able to attract more diverse talent across a big region. And I think for people with disabilities, that's an option for them to be able to take part in the interview process from the comfort of their home. But that said, we also know online interviewing tools have their own challenges. And Sam, do you want to share anything around that?
Yeah, I mean, they absolutely do. Unfortunately, not every online interviewing tool is accessible. And the other place where there's difficulty with accessibility, I know you've experienced this, Alvar, during some of Fable's hiring, is some of those tests that you have someone you're interviewing perform in order to test their skills, accessibility hasn't been thought of there. And so the results are either going to be biased against someone with a disability, right? Or a person with a disability just isn't going to be able to complete that test. And it could, because it's an online interview, the effect of that is magnified, right? Because that's something that you're really depending on to judge someone.
Yeah, and that's why, right? Like when it's online, tool becomes such an essential part of that process. And we have so many job application platforms that have really good features where, you know, you get to ask questions, people can either verbally answer it, write it in written format. But if that in itself is not accessible, then it is not an accessible option. So there is ways to go for us in terms of improving the space. I'd like to jump into a participant's experience. So one of the survey participants said, I've participated in interviews that were not at all accessible, and that has caused much frustration and stress. I'm always very relieved when I encounter an accessible platform, as it enables me to concentrate and prepare for the questions instead of feeling stressed out and anxious because of an inaccessible platform or website.
Exactly. That's so important, because how can an employer judge someone fairly if they're interviewing two people and one person had to jump through a whole bunch of accessibility hoops and the other person didn't? I mean, I wonder who's going to perform better in the interview process, right? It's pretty obvious.
And just the stress of it, right? Like if you had to, and I'm sure, Sam, you've experienced this as well when we've kind of tried different online conferencing tools, if, you know, just the struggle of getting set up and the impact and the mental impact of it that it can have on you when you are interviewing.
Exactly. And I think this says something important too about what companies can do as they integrate accessibility into their processes. If you put some of this accessibility data up front, you can really take a lot of the stress off of the participants of the interview so that they know they're going to have an accessible experience and they don't have to be anxious about that. Whether it's, if you're a company that already employs people with disabilities, you could highlight what their experience was like through the application process to reassure new folks. If you're not, you could highlight that, you know, you're willing to work with people and that you're committed to diversity, and that if a method is unavailable, alternative methods are you know, offered. And one thing that we've had good luck with at Fable and gotten good feedback about is asking upfront if people need certain accommodations. Yes or no? Are you able to speak? Yes or no? Do you require sign language accommodation? Because it reassures people, if we're asking that yes or no judgment-free question, we're probably prepared to handle the answer. And it takes one burden off of folks of having to request the accommodation, especially when they've just been asked upfront if that's something they need.
Yeah, I think providing information to candidates can have a huge impact from two fronts. From this is something we've been doing at Fable, where, you know, when we are considering potential candidates, sharing the entire interview process. So these are the stages of the interview process. This is what is expected out of you at every stage. And these are the tools we're going to be using during those processes, which lets candidates be more informed about what to expect. And then the part that you said, Sam, like instead of saying, do you require accommodation, or, you know, please let us know the accommodation that you require, where you're still asking the candidate to share what they need, versus just giving a list of accommodations that we can provide and then having the candidate pick and choose. It also sets a different culture, right? Like people are more comfortable now sharing, which can also be very beneficial to attracting the right talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the culture change that is so important, because we've talked about it a little bit as we talked about resumes, but it's also the culture shift in what are you trying to get from an interview, right? And shifting to interviewing people in a forward-looking way, where you're interviewing them about their skills and talents and potential rather than about their past experience, right? Is such a shift, I think.
Yeah. So I'd like to move on to the third part of the employment process that you spoke about, Sam, which is like performance and maintenance. And so here the insight we collected was that 24% of respondents would consider their day-to-day experiences on the job accessible.
Again, that's less than 1/4.
That is less than 1/4, but that's the highest accessibility rating of all the stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's high for a couple of reasons. First of all, because if a candidate has been able to get through the barriers around job application, the barriers around interviewing, you probably have some accessibility knowledge in the company that you're applying for. So you're a little bit more likely to have accessible tools or the accessibility support that you need in order to perform your job. But secondly, if you are a skilled computer user who can navigate around all of these barriers, even if your job gives you a tool that may not really be accessible, but you can navigate your way around the barriers, then you will probably find that, well, a lot of these tools I have to use, they're not accessible, but I can get them to work. So I guess I'm having my experience is all right. I can keep my job. Whereas so many folks have already been knocked out, been excluded in the previous two stages.
Yeah, but like that point of being able to do their job is are they being able to do their job and it's taking them 2 hours to do something that someone who's able-bodied doing the same function would just take a fraction of that time, and what is the impact on that employee?
Exactly. What is the impact on the employee and what is the impact on the team? And has accessibility been considered throughout the company? I know too many folks who, for example, work at a call center and the software to take calls and to log support requests is fully accessible, but none of the employee oversight software is accessible and none of the management software is accessible. So they're just stuck in that one place. They can never be promoted. They can never work their way up because this is the only place that the company has created accessible jobs. And like, what kind of incentive is that for an employee that's already struggling?
Yeah, I think from an employer perspective, that's where we're just limiting employees' ability to grow within an organization. And then even just with their current job responsibilities, like how is performance evaluated? Are you considering that you've as an employer, you've provided them tools that don't function properly, which can impact their performance? And then the other part that you said, Sam, it's like, what are the opportunities available and the career paths available for them within that organization? So the part I think we always see is, companies have a certain quota of, people with disabilities that they want to represent within their organization. And it's not about just getting people, through the door, but it's about maintaining and retaining that talent. But if you're not giving opportunities for a person with a disability to grow within an organization, are you retaining that talent?
Exactly. It doesn't matter how many people with disabilities you bring through the door if they all can't perform the job and get laid off, almost immediately or in a year. And that brings to the quote that's on the next slide that we found. Like someone said in the survey, as a blind individual, the choices made from a software perspective can dictate if I can or cannot perform my work duties. That's why it's important to incorporate accessibility within the procurement process. And, unfortunately, that isn't being done often. And when it is being done, I think sometimes it's not being done in perhaps ways that are as helpful as they could be, because we have these examples of folks losing their jobs because of a software upgrade. And so how can employers start to validate that? I know we're starting to hear a lot about VPADs, which are the voluntary accessibility kind of requirement statement. And like from an employer perspective, are VPADs useful and helpful to you in looking at something and determining if employees of a company with a disability will be able to use the product?
I have a lot of thoughts on VPAD that might not be accepted by everyone, but I think VPAD is like the little like crawl step that you take to start thinking about accessibility, right? But VPAD in itself are just, they're looking at compliance, and it's probably being used by people from the procurement side who have no idea about accessibility. It's probably being submitted by people who have no idea about accessibility. And what we're talking about is, are employees able to use the tool to perform their job? Are VPADs doing that? No, I don't think so. And so when it comes to procurement processes, that's what we need to focus on. It's like, if you are deciding to procure a tool that is going to be used internally, have that tested with people with disabilities across different assistive technologies, and really evaluate how accessible and usable this is. And then you can set your bar on what you think is okay to proceed to procure. But I think the perspective and people with disabilities perspective of if this tool is usable is essential.
Absolutely, especially for organizations who already have people with disabilities working there. It's the saddest thing when I constantly hear these stories, and if you just search on the internet, you'll find people telling these stories of being laid off because of a tool that was upgraded, when like they already worked there and they could have done some testing, and if it had been required in the maintenance contracts and things that the vendors maintain accessibility, this could have been avoided, right? And it's interesting to me that I don't think from Fable's side, both as a vendor and as someone that sells access to a platform to our customers, I don't think accessibility comes up in contracts very often, does it?
I think for us, it's a little tricky because we are an accessibility platform that's powered by people with disabilities. So I'm not sure if we don't get asked about that because of the work we do. And we do share with customers that our whole platform is accessible from every single view. But generally, from what I've heard, it's not something that gets asked around a lot. And even if it does, it's not withheld a lot. Like no one's saying, oh, you've submitted this VPAD and you're not fully accessible, so I'm not going to procure you. Like that's not happening yet. So I think one part of it is, yes, we need to evaluate better, but then you also need that more senior leadership support to say that, yes, we're not going to procure if it doesn't match our standards. And the other point I wanted to touch on here, Sam, and this is something you've experienced, is the tool needs to work across assistive technologies and across different people's needs. Can you share a little bit about your experience of shifting from NVDA to JAWS?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been a very long time NVDA user. NVDA is the open source screen reader for Windows, non-visual desktop access. It's open source. It's developed by blind folks. I love the philosophy behind it. But as I continued to work with Fable, I found that I needed to switch away from NVDA and adopt JAWS. And the reason for that was because all Microsoft Office products were accessible in NVDA. You could complete the tasks, but it took a very long time. Whereas JAWS had focused on efficiency and providing extra features and extra hotkeys and interface changes that would not just make it accessible to me, but that would make me able to use the functions in Microsoft Office as quickly as someone who wasn't using a screen reader. And so when we talk about these things, we've got to get beyond just can somebody do something, and we've got to get to, can they do it efficiently? Can they do it quickly? And can they do it in a way that will allow them to keep up with the rest of the team? Because if the answer to those things is no, even if they can do everything, they're not going to either be promoted or they're not going to get the great performance reviews that they want. They're not going to get the promotions that they are due and that they should otherwise get because they're skilled employees and workers who've been with the organization for a long time. And I think it comes to partially the testing not being good enough. I think it comes to some of us as people with disabilities can also get focused on, can I use this and can I do this? Because so often the answer to that question is no. But I think we've also as companies, as people, got to start asking more than just can I do it, but can I do it efficiently and in a way that will support maintaining my job?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think on the point of like various like assistive technologies, the fact that JAWS worked really well for you with Microsoft. We've constantly heard, how assistive technology is expensive and it's not easy to afford. And so that can also be like another barrier for people to be able to try out different technologies and figure out what works best for them. And as employers, I think that's an area that, we can make sure to provide options for whatever assistive technologies that people need access to do the job in a manner that they feel comfortable.
Absolutely. And I wanted to return to something that's tangentially related that you had said about culture and about leadership needing to support this and needing to say, no, we won't buy the product, or no, we won't install the upgrade if it breaks accessibility. There's another cultural change that needs to happen and that we at Fable have had to make. Because even at a company that is an accessibility company and laser focused on accessibility, sometimes we have to depend on tools that we don't control and on vendors that we don't control. And sometimes not all the tools work perfectly at all times. And so we've had to make changes and make sure our culture embraces that. And like, can talk a little bit about like, I mean, for you as a CEO, that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're managing people with disabilities.
Yeah, we have, a diverse team. We have people with disabilities, different backgrounds. And I think the reality is that tools aren't there yet. And we understand that, it's a process and we're seeing companies make improvements and investing in it, but it's not something that's just going to, fix itself tomorrow. And so recognizing the shortfalls of tools, we've kind of approached it from a concept of just job sharing and not letting the tool be the limitation to perform the job. So they might be things, Sam's really good at doing compared to some of our other employees, but some of the tools and like Excel and using data and crunching out numbers might be a little more harder or time consuming for Sam. So that's when we divide up the tasks a little bit differently internally so that each employee are able to work on their strengths. And it's a journey, it's an iterative process, and we're at that scale where we can try out different things and figure out who's responsible for what and who can be using what tools. But it has across the organization just made people much more aware of where tools are and how we can help each other out to perform our jobs.
Exactly. And I don't think it's been for us a matter of like hiring more employees because of it. It's just been a matter of setting roles differently, right? Too many corporations are afraid like, oh, if I hire someone with a disability, now it's going to be really, really expensive and I've got to hire more people to support them and all this, right? But I don't think that's really been our experience about Fable. It's just about changing the internal culture.
I know we're coming close to time and I want to make sure we're leaving room for questions, but I know we have a couple of slides that I'm hoping we can breeze through a little bit. And so the last part of this session is on how can employers improve the accessibility of their employment processes. Sam, can you kind of walk us through those 3 different stages we talked about and a couple of incremental improvements that we can start doing right away?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, the first critical thing that can be done is in that identification and application step is making sure that there are alternatives and that there's an alternative accessible form that can be filled out for someone who wants to apply for a job at your company, that there are alternative accessible tools that can be used to file that application, so that no potential employee has to go through the experience of like contacting your company's support to say, hey, I'd like to work here, but I can't file my application, and then having to go fishing through LinkedIn for like your HR contact. That shouldn't be an experience that anyone has to have. And then when it comes to interviewing and acceptance, it's the culture changes that we talked about. It's moving away from kind of the quota thing and thinking I have to hire this many people with disabilities immediately, and thinking, how can I interview people and how can I set them up for success? And so it's figuring out what the job responsibilities for them will be, and figuring out what the tools will be and how they can use those tools, and how things can be adapted and can be set up so that they can be successful in the current job, and so that they can be successful enough that they have room to grow and that they have room to be promoted. And it's also that evaluating for potential, not just for the past experience that someone has, but their potential right now, because they might have those employment gaps and they might never have had that kind of employment experience that someone else might have. And so it's shifting the culture of the interview. And then lastly, it's about the job maintenance and performance. It's about making the accessibility and procurement. Accessibility has to be part of procurement, it has to be part of maintenance, and it has to be part of the process. Because if it's not part of the process, then eventually a tool is going to come along and be adopted, or an upgrade is going to happen. And not only will you not be able to hire new people with disabilities, but you'll put the people that you hired out of a job. And that's also something that you never want to have happen.
Let's shift to the last part here, and I think we've touched a little bit about each of these throughout the presentation, but the question here is, how can we go beyond tools? And with digital, obviously tools play a crucial role, but employing people with disabilities and making sure your teams are diverse and inclusive, there's much more to it. And I think one of the things is for us to recognize the biases in tools in itself and how it can misrepresent potential. And the part that Sam said about culture plays a really big role, I think. If it needs to start with culture, and then through culture, tools can also be influenced. Sam, what are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a common saying that is said so frequently it's become almost like an aphorism, but it's absolutely true. And it's that you can't solve social problems with programming or with code. You can't program away problems of culture and problems of bias and problems of sort of social lack of acceptance. The first thing you've got to do is you've got to make the culture changes. And when those culture changes get made and get embedded, then you will develop and create and procure the tools to support a unbiased, inclusive culture. But when you have a culture that is not inclusive and that is already biased, all the tools are going to do is reinforce the biases that you already have and make them worse and make it even harder to get out of that place.
Yeah, and I think for us, it's recognizing it's a shared responsibility, right? It can't be one person responsible for making sure we are, hiring diverse talent. I think at Fable, we all do a pretty good job of holding each other accountable. So, whether that's in our Zoom chats and when people, share images, like there's always alternative text. If we have a new employee, they might post their first photo without alt text, but as soon as they see, the habit within the culture, they just say, okay, yeah, every picture has to have an alt text. And I think similarly with when we're in meetings, making sure like captions are turned on. And I think there's a part of holding each other accountable to really achieve this goal as well.
Absolutely. And something that we do well at Fable is making sure that it's not just the person who needs it who has to be requesting it all the time, right? Like it's all of us. We make sure the captions come on and that the alt text happens, and doing it in a way that is collaborative and that is cooperative and that is not about blaming. It's about helping everyone grow. I mean, a good example that I sort of see of that sometimes is we'll have a new employee who doesn't post alt text, and instead of yelling at them or guilt tripping them, another employee will just come in and post the alt text for them.
Mhm.
And without being critical, they just immediately, get the point and the understanding that, oh, I should be doing that because everyone else does it.
Exactly. So I think we did go over, Sam. The two of us are too chatty, so we cut into a little bit of the Q&A time. But let's jump into some questions here. I see a question from Judy that says, Sam, how do you feel about organizations having a statement indicating if you require this information in an alternate format, please contact?
I mean, it's tricky. Ideally, the alternative format should be there, and you shouldn't have to contact anybody, right? I mean, what is stopping an organization from putting out transcriptions of their videos and from making sure alternative text happens and from making sure that web pages and PDF files are accessible, right? That's something that is part of a good culture. But at the same time, we can't know every single person's needs. Even at Fable, we ask people directly, what accommodations do you need? And we give people options. But there will always be a need that we haven't thought of. And so I think it is important to be open to that and to be really willing to listen to those requests and to those needs and to accommodate them. But I think we should be accommodating as many of the needs as we can without someone having to file a special request to get the accessible PDF.
Yeah, I think making as many alternative formats available is key. And I think also where does this statement live? Like, is the statement just part of, the job description? If you're posting this on social, are you also including, please, let us know if you need any accommodations? I think highlighting accessibility is also a big part of it, which signals to the potential employee that, okay, this is something that they are open to considering and I will be welcomed here.
And I think it highlights to other employees that this is a welcoming, accepting place for me to work, and even can help you attract talent that doesn't necessarily need that accommodation to apply, who maybe otherwise would not have applied to work for you, because people like to work in teams that are open and that accommodate and that support one another. And sharing accessibility is a good way to demonstrate that you are that type of team.
We have another question here, which is, what are your thoughts on having employee resource groups that are focused on disability?
I think it's super important for internal advocacy. I think it's really important. I mean, before I came to Fable, I've been all about building communities, whether it's on Reddit or whether it's mailing lists that bring screen reader users together to advocate and to support one another. And I think it's so important that if you are employed with a company and there are other people with disabilities employed at that company, that you are able to get together and swap needs and talk about what's happening at the company and advocate for the cultural change and the systems change and the tools change that you need and that you would love to see. And it's important that companies support that, just like they would support any other group who wants to come together and who wants to advocate for themselves in that way. However, the one thing that does give me a bit of reservation that seems to happen when it comes to accessibility support groups internally is that sometimes companies will sort of lean on that as like, okay, here's where we're going to find all of our people with disabilities so we can do some kind of representation and marketing that might feel like tokenism, or here's the people where we can ask to do all of the testing of all of our tools, and we're just going to like make that an unpaid add-on to their already existing job responsibilities, and we're not going to take anything off. We're not going to make it an official part of their job, but like now this group just gets reached out to for all of the testing that we need done, and they just have to fit it in around their already existing job, right?
Yeah, I think that's definitely my worry as well. Like I know with large organizations, like you need different groups focused on different areas, but I've also seen it from just in the industry of how quickly that group is the only group that's even going to think about accessibility. I think following these groups just make people being like us, okay, they'll figure that part out, and that separation is not good from a cultural standpoint. So we have another question here, which is, how can we influence our employers to implement changes to make the hiring process more accessible? Some of the things you propose are awesome ideas, but I have trouble imagining how a large company could be persuaded to implement them.
I mean, that is a difficult question. I think part of it is really talking about the value that people with disabilities bring and shifting the narrative from like, this is something we have to do for legal reasons, or this is something we have to do for compliance reasons, to talk about this is something that we want to do and we need to do in order to make us as a company more competitive, in order to bring in skilled workers that are otherwise, we couldn't hire. And in order to increase the diversity of our teams so that we have more different types of voices involved in what we do, and so that we are creating better products and better experiences for our customers because our teams reflect the diversity of our customers. Do you have anything to add there, Alvar, from kind of the employer perspective?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. I think working part of a large organization and bringing change has so much challenges and complexities to it. I think having leadership support goes a long way. I think we've seen it with companies like Microsoft, and their CEO directly invested in saying accessibility is like one of the top priorities for the organization, which is a huge signal for the entire organization to prioritize accessibility. I think it's also important to recognize that change doesn't come quick, and changes like this does not come quick. It is small, incremental, bit-sized changes that will ultimately result in a diverse team. So one of the things I would recommend is, if you are in a position where you have the opportunity to hire someone and you have headcount, you making it the priority, saying that I am going to make sure that this candidate, this position is going to be filled by someone with a disability who matches the skill set for the role. And by setting that example and going through the process of making sure that this role is filled and bringing diverse talent into the team can have ripple effects. And I think that's a way to step forward. Any last thoughts there, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just parsing that, and I think part of it too sort of harkens back to the internal groups. And if you have sort of internal disability support groups already at your company, is advocating for supports on the teams that you work with, because the team that you work in is experienced. They now know what it's like to work with someone who lives with a disability, and that it's not scary or difficult or this big huge thing. And like advocating locally on each of your teams and coordinating that effort between all of the employees with disabilities is, I think, what can make a huge effect, and what can demonstrate to leadership from a bottom-up perspective that this is something that can be done.
Exactly. It is a fight between the top down and bottom up, but it's not either or. It needs to happen simultaneously, and at some point you're going to meet in the middle. But yeah, recognizing that this is a journey, and celebrating the little wins that you do have, in like the hope of making sure your teams are inclusive and diverse. And so I know we're at time, so This was a great discussion. Thank you all for joining, and I will hand it over to Christopher.
Oh, wow, Sam, that was excellent, and the engagement in the chat was phenomenal, and I really appreciate the comments. I do have one quick, I know we're at the end, one quick question though that I was dying to ask, and that deals with AI employment recruitment software. We're seeing more and more of that happening right now. Any thoughts around that in a 30-second bite?
I think Sam can jump in there. He's been doing a lot of research here.
Yeah, AI is in a large part reflecting the biases that we already have, because what we're doing is we're training AI systems on who makes a good employee and who does not. And what it's picking up as we train it, it's picking up the current descriptions that our hiring managers are already making. And as we can see from the existing data, that those current descriptions are already pretty flawed. And so if we want to get around AI bias, first thing we got to do is get better training data, and get training data that doesn't include all of the existing biases. Because if we teach AI the existing biases, of course it's going to just reinforce them, and it will reinforce them in a way that, unlike our current systems, is just some algorithm somewhere and that is not examinable and that is difficult to talk about. And so that's the first step. And the second step is the cultural change, is making sure that we are all understanding how the AI is coming to its results, that those results are really reflective of the results that we want it to generate, and that we have some alternative and some kind of oversight to say, hey, the AI only seems to be hiring people with disability and this ethnicity. We better fix it, and we better work around it, and we better find better ways of hiring people and have those alternative methods to get into our company that don't depend on the AI.
Excellent. Thank you. This is Christopher. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Great points. I want to thank Interpreter Beth. Thank you very much. And our captionist. This has been amazing, and I'm sure we'll be having some follow-up around this. Alwar and Sam, thank you.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks for coming.